Thank you very much, James. Thank you for your welcome, but also thank you for setting an excellent context for the 2 days of hopefully very stimulating debate, which we will have both as academics, practitioners and indeed policymakers in this room. No doubt, as we go on, you'll see areas which I agree with you, and you'll see areas which I disagree with you, and that's great because hopefully that will stimulate some debate as we proceed. I very simply, and it is very simply, want to look at 3 research questions this morning. First of all, the macro level. Has Ireland become an innovation-driven economy? At the micro level, secondly, what are the factors that drive innovation in the organisation? And finally, in terms of policy, how does public support achieve its aim of increasing the number of research and development and innovation active businesses? Sorry, I've lost a slide by the looks of it. There it is. I'll have to go back one. Policy context. The period in which we're looking at is really from 1991 right through to 2005, almost actually 2008, which I'll mention in a minute. And James had alluded to the enterprise strategy in 2004. But we want to take a little bit step back further and see what actually has happened in that time. The priority of industrial policy over that period has been promoting innovation and developing innovation capability, and with a particular focus on locally owned indigenous companies. It corresponds to the publication of the Culleton Report in 1992, which provided the impetus for the prominence of building technology capability in industrial policy. But it would be wrong to ignore the role that Europe had, and particularly both in terms of policy development, but also in terms of the substantial investment through structural funds in driving up the levels of investment that Ireland subsequently made in research and development and in innovation activity within our businesses. The motivation was this, and if you closed your eyes and didn't know that this was from 1994, you would see the relevance for today. Firms which possess and exploit technology are best positioned to take maximum advantage of shifts in the world economic environment. Without a strong technological capability, Ireland's industry is likely to be little more than a pawn on the battlefield of global competition. A pawn. And we wanted to move from being a pawn to being a frontiersman. And it's fabulous that James also used this quote. Maybe you were looking at my slides, were you? And it states, Ireland by 2013 will be internationally renowned for the excellence of its research and will be to the forefront in generating and using new knowledge for economic and social progress within an innovation-driven culture. So this idea that Ireland was to move from being a pawn to being a frontiersman, that's the context in which we're looking at. Has it achieved that aim? Just to backtrack one slide very quickly, I just want to clarify where this data is coming from. It's coming from the Irish Innovation Panel, which has been running for 15 years, almost 18 years, because we have almost finished the next round of the survey. Had this conference been a month away, I would have had those results for you. It consists of 5, now to be 6, linked surveys dating back to the 1991 period. Covers manufacturing, but since 2001 it has also incorporated tradable services. For the purposes of today, however, I'm focusing on the manufacturing sector, and it looks specifically at 10 plus employees. Information we collect is on innovation. We look at product, process, organisational change. We look at R&D activity, functional flexibility in innovation, human capital formation, investments and financial performance, market profile, innovation business strategy, technology adoption, innovation networks, government assistance and barriers to innovation. So you can see that there are very close parallels to the information collected in the Community Innovation Survey, What I would say, however, is that we take a broader definition of product innovation and process innovation, because the strict definition as applied by the Community Innovation Survey is a little too severe for small companies. It's too technologically focused. It emphasises the need for significant technological change in product innovation, which, because we're an economy dominated by small businesses, excludes a lot of the activity going on there. It provides direct evidence, and there is a wealth of additional detail. Because we have ownership of this data, it's not a government survey, we also have profiles of companies over time. So we can do a lot of analysis which just would not otherwise be possible. So that's the data source that I'm going to be referring to. So the trends in Ireland's innovation performance, the line chart that I have up here relates specifically just to product innovation and process innovation. By product innovation, we mean, have they introduced any new or improved products over the last 3 years prior to that survey? Or process innovation, similarly, have they introduced any new or improved processes over the period before, the 3-year period before the interview? You will see from this that the thing that's perhaps most striking is actually the stability of innovation activity over all that period. 62.8% of businesses were reporting that they were introducing product changes in 1991 to 1993. By 2003-2005, despite the substantial level of public investment that was being made in building R&D capability in the country, it had still only reached 67.9%, so roughly about 5% increase in the proportion of innovative firms undertaking product innovation. You'll notice that the profile reflects really what was happening in the market as well over that time. The 90s was very buoyant, and we see that reflected in incremental increases in the amount of product innovation that was occurring. We then have the downturn at the millennium, the economic downturn in that period, and that's reflected in a decline both in product and process innovation levels. And then we have the bounce back that occurred from that in terms of product innovation. What's more worrying is the pink line that you have, which relates to process innovation. Process innovation dipped at the millennium, but process innovation did not recover. And we'll look at that in a few minutes in a bit more detail. Very quickly, let's compare it to our nearest neighbour. Let's compare it to Northern Ireland. Now remember as well that Northern Ireland tends to be in the lower quartile of performing regions within the United Kingdom. The orange line represents product innovation in Northern Ireland, and the green line, being politically correct, represents process innovation in Northern Ireland. If you compare the blue line for Ireland and the orange line for Northern Ireland, you'll see that the pattern is roughly similar. They're following similar trajectory over that period. A couple of things to note, however. Northern Ireland tends to always trail behind the Republic in terms of the proportion of companies that are undertaking innovation activity. And it tends to follow market trends, so you get the dip, the economic downturn at the millennium. However, Northern Ireland was not hit as hard at this period, largely because of the sectors that it has, and it doesn't have the same number of multinationals and proportion of businesses within those high-tech sectors. So the impact was not felt as much within the north, and therefore, subsequently in coming out of the downturn, Ireland bounded back much quicker. The trend, they're slightly lower throughout, but in addition to that, you'll also find that actually Northern Ireland has converged. It's closing the gap with the Republic over this period in terms of product innovation, from about 11 percentage points at the start of the period to about 9, and hopefully with the next survey will show that that has further declined, the distance between them. More striking is what's happening, and this is where the story gets more interesting, in terms of process innovation. Here we have a situation where, again, the north was lagging behind the south, following very much the same trajectory, largely driven by the economic market conditions. But post the millennium, you have Ireland continue not being able to pick up the process innovation activity, but Northern Ireland improving at that point to actually surpass the Republic at that stage. Now, if you look a bit further into the data, which I don't have time to go into today, you'll find that actually, while you were getting product bounce back in the Republic, you weren't getting that matched by process changes. So what products they were doing tended to be much more incremental product changes in recent years. Whereas in the North, the product changes have been matched by process changes. Process changes are no more needed where you were introducing new products into your company. And this is reflected in sales. So the Republic of Ireland have bounced back. They haven't introduced new processes, and in some ways it's almost an aesthetic bounce back because it's dominated by improvements, whereas in the North they're now forging ahead with introducing new products. Obviously there's a local foreign-owned story to be told for the South, and this data relates only to the South. The blue line, the middle line, is the average product innovation trajectory over the period which you've already seen. The green line at the top is the foreign-owned. The pink line is the locally owned. This data should not be compared local to foreign-owned in saying that the local-owned are performing less well. That is not necessarily the case because of sectoral adjustments that you would need to make for that. What is more important is that the trajectory of both are pretty consistent over that period. Where it's not consistent, however, is for the process innovation. So the story that I've already communicated to you about what's been happening with product and process change in the Republic of Ireland, if you look at this, you have the foreign owned at the top, the green line, and the locally owned on the pink line, and you actually find that in terms of process changes, Indigenous companies are continuing to make those changes. The big impact is coming from the foreign-owned companies that post the millennium downturn, they were introducing new products, but they were the ones, the foreign-owned sector, that have cut back in terms of the process changes and therefore cut back in the introduction of new and more radical to the market products. The question, I guess, is where does that leave us now? As we look now to the 2008-2009 period, is that change in the nature of innovation going to be reflected in the competitiveness of businesses subsequently? What is driving plants' innovation activity? So turning away for a moment from the macro level to the micro level, here we are really just looking at the fifth wave of the survey, so 2002 to 2005, and we're undertaking cross-sectional analysis, and we're modelling the relationship between through an innovation production function. And it's a situation whereby the knowledge sourced, the KS, is translated into innovation outputs, and in which the effectiveness by which this knowledge sourced, whether that's externally or whether it's through research and development within the organisation, the effectiveness of the translation activity, how much that is affected by the resources within the company, or the barriers that the company experiences to innovation, and the extent to which they have received government assistance. Some of the key findings from this analysis, without boring you too much. The critical importance of research and development, that comes out in this analysis, it comes out time and time again. We find that if you are a plant that you undertake research and development activity, you are 30% more likely to be a product innovator. You're 19% more likely to be a process innovator, and you're likely to have about 11% more of your sales from new products and 23% of your sales from new and improved products over those plants that are not undertaking research and development activity. And this suggests the value of government attempts to boost research and development. We are still in a situation where we only have half of the level of research and development as undertaken in Denmark, and a third of that's undertaken in Finland and in Israel. And if you reflect back on one of the charts that James had up, where we were a follower or a catcher up, actually the leaders, those were the leaders. Those are the companies and countries that are investing heavily in research and development. Backward innovation linkages also prove to be important. So having businesses that are closely linked into their suppliers in driving forward new changes to products and processes, and indeed organisational changes, is having a very significant effect on innovation activity. You're 11 to 12% more likely to be undertaking product and process innovation, and you will have approximately about 8% more of your sales from new and improved products. Other knowledge sources are perhaps less important, or not coming out to have the same sort of strength of importance on innovation activity. And this is, in fact, somewhat contrary to the model that we anticipate, and we've been led to believe, like an open innovation model, where we should be linking to all these different partners. And it suggests that Ireland actually is being driven by a relatively narrow range of external knowledge sources. Question is that attributable to low research and development, and therefore low absorptive capacity in these organisations? And others research that we have done, in fact others have done, do support that. What is rather concerning, and I think this is the point hopefully that we're going to explore more over the next day, is the lack of the relationship between public knowledge sources and innovation activity. And there may be some explanations for this. However, given the investment that the Irish government have made in building research capability in the university and higher education sector more widely, it's very concerning that where companies are linking into them, that we're not finding it having any effect on their innovation activity. No doubt we'll come back to this. Very quickly, in terms of the resource base, we find that plant size is an important effect on process innovation, but it's a non-linear relationship. It's an inverted U shape, so it's those medium-sized companies where the impact is actually hitting. Plant age is found to be unimportant. Graduates are found to be unimportant. However, I would caution the interpretation of that, because we find that graduates, when you break down innovation into its different distinct stages, they may actually have a more important role to play in knowledge exploitation. Foreign-owned, if you're foreign-owned, you're 20% more likely to be a product innovator, and you're 7.5% more sales are likely to be coming from new products. And if, again, this R&D variable comes out, if you can get access to group research and development, then you're 17% more likely to be a product innovator, above and beyond what you are doing internally in your own organisation. Public sector support, a thorny issue. Has it actually made a difference? Well, yes, actually it has. And individual evaluations of programmes tend to be positive. Our results also demonstrate that there is a positive relationship. An increase of about 22%, the probability that a plant will be a product or a process, 30% for process innovators. So if you are a government department and you are funding a business to undertake innovation, it's likely to have positive effect. There is a good news story there. I'll come back to the negative bit of that in a minute. But it'll also then increase your sales that you get from new products by about 17%. The barriers that James referred to as well, in terms of those experienced by companies in undertaking innovation, they don't all affect businesses in the same way. Some may say, yes, we experience this, but quite often they're saying they experience it because they've put themselves in a situation where they're more aware of it. So there is a perception aspect here, and when you actually include it in the modelling, you find that there's a lack of significance on skills and finance. So if you ask them, have you a barrier to innovation in terms of your availability of skills, or is a lack of finance acting as a barrier to innovation, we find that those are not particularly significant and strong. And even where they say, yes, finance is an issue for me, actually there are ways in which they are then going about trying to deal with that. More significant is a lack of partners. And again, this comes back to our earlier finding that Irish companies have a very narrow focus on partners, which tends to be dominated by supplier organisations. If they say they have a lack of partners, we find that actually it's pulling back innovation activity by about 12 to 13%. and the effect on innovation success by 10 to 12%. So this partnership issue is actually quite a thorny issue to try and understand, to grapple with, and really to help to come forward with policy initiatives to deal with it. Regulation, again, is also having an effect by reducing sales of new products by about 7%. And this suggests the advantage of policy to strengthen innovation partnerships and reduce regulation going forward. I want to just make a comment about innovation persistence. I could actually talk extensively about innovation persistence, but time does not permit. Paul O'Reilly does not permit me, as he's coming next. So I'll mention it very briefly, because in some ways it provides the bridge between the micro situation where we have policy, government support for innovation in organisations being very positive, and yet we counter that with a picture of Ireland really having not gone very far over the last 15, 18 years in terms of innovation performance. So we have a situation whereby if a company is getting support for innovation, it's having a positive effect on them actually producing something, bringing new products to the market, and for that impacting positively on their sales. The problem is keeping them at it. So it's about working with those companies that are first-timers, that have not undertaken innovation or invested in research and development in whatever guise, either formally or informally, in the past. The question is, how do we keep persistence going in those organisations? Once they've started, how do we sustain that into the future? What we find from the quantitative data analysis on this is that there is evidence of cumulative, creative accumulation, so that they're building up the resources from one period to the next. And this tends to be stronger for product innovation and than process innovation. So they will tend to dip in and out quite a lot more for process innovation as opposed to product innovation. Once they start on that product innovation route, they're more likely to sustain that. Slight differences for locally owned and small and medium enterprises. We do find greater persistence, however it's more dominated by non-persistence activity. So they're the organisations that actually it's taking a little bit more effort to shake them out of that nothing is happening here mentality. Sectors, we find that they all tend to be persistent, either positively or negatively, with exceptions of paper and printing and electrical and optical, which are constantly moving between this state of flux of they'll innovate over one period and then they don't need to innovate perhaps for another couple of years, then they'll go at it again. So there is a lot of, this is actually quite a complicated subject, but it's one actually to more raise awareness of. It's not just about policy intervention, it's about sustaining that into the future, and it's an area that we really don't know very much about. From an academic and a policy perspective, the short answer is always, well, you build capability. If you want them to innovate into the future and sustain that, give them the resources, make sure they've got the resources, behavioural additionality. Once they've done it once, then they have the skills and expertise to keep doing that into the future. From the qualitative analysis, and we did a number of case studies of companies experiencing different profiles of persistence, we find that yes, that is the case, but the role of resources tend to be much more passive. They will get the resources, they will work within the limits of the resources. What seems to be more important is actually the strategic considerations. What about the market? Trying to get companies to think about their organisational form. Can they work with other partners? How can that contribute to the innovation process? And so on. So a narrow capability-based explanation of innovation persistence, I would suggest, is inadequate. And instead, a more strategically aware, systemic and contextual approach is what we need. Let me bring this sort of round to a conclusion, back to the key questions. Has Ireland become an innovation-driven economy? Has it become that frontiersman as opposed to the pawn in the global marketplace? I would suggest that there's limited evidence to support this, certainly in terms of the innovation metrics. We have decline in process innovation, particularly in foreign-owned sector, and suggestions of a move to more incremental development. What are the factors that are driving innovation? R&D capability remains critically important, and I think policymakers should not shy away from the importance of research and development, both internally but also through an open innovation model by a means by which you're accessing external forms of research and development. Backward linkages to suppliers is very important. Government financial support is important. It is having an effect. And yes, we are off the scale in terms of the level of support. Maybe it's a question of how best then to maximise that and to build the persistence of that innovation activity over time. And foreign-owned companies, there still are major benefits and lessons to be learned from them, and they are having a positive impact on innovation activity. What's less good on the negative side is lack of innovation partners. Absence of public-partner effect. Why are we not getting any sort of significant effect where companies work with universities and other public labs? Why is that not translating into innovation? And regulation. And I know significant efforts are being made on this. Very finally, in relation to the third question, we see that the aim of increasing the number of research and development and innovation active businesses, that is as valid today as it was back in 1991, 1993. Has it been effective? Well, there is, at a micro level, yes it has. At a macro level, it's more questionable. Certainly, there have been significant number of initiatives in recent years, such as the innovation vouchers, competence research centres and so on, to build greater capability and greater synergy between the private sector and the public sector. Again, this brings us back into, well, how effective is this? The innovation vouchers in particular is a means by which companies can make that first step into a university to access that knowledge. What's happening after that? And that's something we now need to monitor as that programme is rolled out over the forthcoming years. The challenge is about building persistence of innovation activity. We are helping lots of companies out there as government bodies, but to what extent are they sustaining that into the future? How is that translating into sales? And there is an inadequacy of policy initiatives focusing on internal capability and behavioural additionality. Policy needs to look a little bit broader and also to account for strategic competences, building awareness of international markets, trying to build the links into international markets and network participation. And this is particularly important, I think, in terms of James's point about convergent technologies.